One of the things that we have to keep in mind when we think about Syria and when we think about the questions of intervention, what role should the West play, what role should the United States and Europe, what role should the major powers play in this, that it's actually been remarkable how disciplined the Syrian opposition has been at keeping those elements in check, at keeping that thirst for vengeance, the thirst to settle accounts from 1982 and also in previous repression by the Assad regime. They've been remarkably effective at that. But that, unfortunately, that doesn't mean that they're going to continue to be effective at keeping this in check in the long term. I think one of the things, and Deb can speak to this because she covers this in detail, in very thorough and nuanced detail in her book. One of the things we learned from the experience in Iraq and when these sectarian forces have been unleashed is that sometimes they can be kept in check for a while. They were kept in check in Iraq in the early years by Shia clerics and political leaders who basically restrained the Shiite militias and Shiite young men and others from going full force in revenge against all the suicide bombings and attacks that were happening and that were piling up, and deaths were piling up at a tremendous rate in 2004, 05, 06. Basically until about late 2005, early 2006, when they could no longer when those leaders could no longer hold their partisans back, and when these Shiite militias unleashed their fury at the Sunnis. One of the remarkable things that Deb writes about in her book is the experience in 2006, 07, 08 in Baghdad, where there was basically sectarian cleansing, where the narrative that's emerged in the U.S. of the Iraq War is that the surge of U.S. troops, pioneered by President Bush and General Petraeus, saved Iraq. Well, that's not the complete story. The surge worked an extent in some places. Other factors came in. One of them was the Sahwa, the Sunni awakening. But one of them was also, Deb chronicles this in her book, which I'm going to ask her about it. One of the things that basically the fire of civil war, it just, in some parts of the country, it burned out. The militias, the Shia militias, especially in Baghdad, had achieved what they set out to do. They cleansed many neighborhoods of Baghdad of Sunnis. And it's a frightening experience, and we've lived, Deb and I have lived sort of portions of this in the Middle East in the past 10 years. But having seen this, and Deb, especially since you chronicled this in the book, do you see parallels, lessons, cautions, warning signs for Syria from that experience in Iraq?
I mean, the thing that was so interesting to document in Baghdad is you didn't really need to displace all that many people to have a demographic shift in Baghdad. Baghdad was always thought of as a Sunni capital. It had all of the cultural trappings of a Sunni capital. That is the majority of Muslims in the region. Since 2007, Baghdad has essentially become a Shiite capital. You can see it in the flags, you can see it in the iconography in the city, you can see it in the way that Shia religious celebrations are carried out. This would have been unthinkable in 2003 and before. And it was a very conscious policy by the most radical of the Shiite groups to change the demographics of Baghdad. And when the surge was announced, they knew that they had a deadline. They'd better get to it and get it done. And so there was a frenzy of sectarian cleansing as the surge began. Because the surge, you don't just all of a sudden say surge and then boom, it's there. No, the surge begins in the south and it has to move up. So they knew that they had the north to just do. And so these neighborhoods became targets for Shia groups to move the Sunnis out. And they all got pushed into Damascus, which opened their borders and allowed these people to come. I'm not saying that the surge had no effect, but you have to look at the surge in stopping the violence in Baghdad in light of this sectarian shift, because that is what happened. Now, there was more than just the Sunnis that got run out of Baghdad. The Christians got run out too. The Christians were the first group to leave Baghdad because they had no protectors and no militias, and we made a couple of huge mistakes. Billy Graham's son arrives with great fanfare to proselytize and convert people at a moment when fundamentalism is boiling in Iraq. And so the Christians were seen as a fifth column to the West, and they were targeted very early. By 2004, churches are being blown up. And in a country that was 3% Christian, they make up 15% of the refugees who are streaming out of Iraq. And at some moment, more than half of the Christian population is out, and they go to Damascus, where Christians have power. They also go to Lebanon. Christians have power in Lebanon. And they go to Amman, where also Christians have power. This example is fresh in everybody's mind at this moment. And so, for example, in Lebanon, the head of the Christian community comes to the American ambassador and says, you know, here's the thing, we support Bashar al-Assad because we're worried about us and we're worried about the Christians in Damascus, but if you could promise us that the Americans would protect Christians, you see, in Syria and Lebanon, then we wouldn't need to support Bashar. Because you see what happened in Iraq, you didn't really do anything for the Christians, and you know, they're almost gone. So if you could change your policy, and what does the American ambassador say? Well, you know, the new constitution in Syria will have protection for minorities. And they say, oh, really? And what would that be worth? Nothing, which is true. That's how we think. You just need laws. You need the proper laws. That'll do it. That'll fix it. But the Christians aren't buying it. They aren't buying it in Lebanon, and they aren't buying it in Syria. The young revolutionaries say, we want a new Syria. We want a democratic Syria. And there are young Christians who are pro-revolution and come out on the streets. But the problem is the older generation just doesn't buy it. They are exactly like the Alawite in Lebanon. If he goes, I go. There's something else that I wanted to address when you're talking about revenge from 1982. You know, we have gotten used to thinking about these revolutions in terms of these are social media revolutions, and it's the cell phone and it's the internet. But in the case of Syria, it's actually Skype. Skype is the most revolutionary communication tool that I know. And it's kind of underreported because you have to watch it, you have to see it to understand how it works. Because it's relatively new. You know, if you leave Syria and go to America or Europe or wherever, for years you were just gone. Maybe you called, you know, because it was expensive to call to Syria. And maybe you called on Ramadan or you called on Christmas and, you know, you had a 5-minute talk. Now with Skypes, I can see my relatives in Michigan. Wow, what a great couch. Wow, that's what you get by moving to the States? So there's that part. There's 100,000 survivors of Hama who live in the UAE. All of them are on Skypes every day with their relatives back in Hama. And they are in the discussion about the uprising. Can we get you medical supplies? There's doctors in Oklahoma who are on Skype. They're arranging to get the wounded out of Hama into Turkey or in Amman. All of this is going on underground. None of us are seeing any of this because they don't need to tell us. They don't want us to know. But you know, sort of, you can't really document it, but it's all happening. Skypes is the magic communication tool that is leveling, that essentially what it's doing. And we saw this in Iraq when they all went to Damascus. They just continued to live in Iraq in their heads because they stayed on Skype. And they were talking to Baghdad every day and watching Baghdad television. So you could be in Damascus and you might as well have been in Baghdad, except for nobody was trying to shoot you in Damascus. This is also now happening in Syria. this community has just expanded. And I know so many Syrian Americans who are deeply involved, who completely turned their clocks around. They get up on Syrian time, and they go to bed on Syrian time, because they are deeply involved in this revolution because of Skype.